Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards. Part 1. Wherein various terms and matters related to the subject of the following discussion are explained and stated. Section 1. Concerning the nature of the will. It may seem unnecessary to define or explain what is meant by the will, since this word is generally as well understood as any other we might use to clarify it. And perhaps this would indeed be the case, if philosophers, metaphysicians, and theological debaters had not made the matter obscure by their complicated discussions. But since such confusion now exists, I believe it will be useful, and will bring greater clarity to what follows, to offer a few words on the subject. So, I observe that the will, without any unnecessary metaphysical complications, is simply that by which the mind chooses anything. The faculty of the will is the power or principle in the mind that enables it to make choices, and an act of the will is nothing other than an act of choosing, or a choice itself. If anyone prefers to define the will as that by which the soul either chooses or refuses, I am satisfied with that, though I believe it is sufficient to say it is that by which the soul chooses. In every act of the will, the mind chooses one thing over another. It chooses something rather than its opposite, or rather than its absence or non-existence. So, when the mind refuses something, it is simply choosing the absence of that thing. Both the positive and the negative are presented to the mind, and it chooses the negative. The mind's act of making that choice is properly an act of the will. The will's determination between the two is a voluntary decision, which is nothing other than making a choice. Therefore, whatever names we use for the acts of the will, choosing, refusing, approving, disapproving, liking, disliking, embracing, rejecting, determining, directing, commanding, forbidding, inclining, being averse, being pleased or displeased, all these can be reduced to the act of choosing. For the soul to act voluntarily is always to act with preference or selection. Mr. Locke says, the will signifies nothing but a power or ability to prefer or choose. And, just before this, he remarks, the word preferring seems best to express the act of volition, though he adds that it is not a perfect fit, for, though a man would prefer flying to walking, yet who can say he ever wills it? But this example does not show that willing is anything more than preferring. We must consider the immediate object of the will regarding walking, or any external action. The will is not directly about being moved from one place to another, whether on the ground or through the air. Those are more distant objects of preference. The will's direct object is the particular exertion itself, the movement of the legs and feet and so forth. When a man wills to walk, what he immediately chooses or prefers is not simply arriving at a certain place, but the exertion and movement of his legs and feet in that moment. His will to bring about this change in his body right now is simply his preference for that action over not doing it. God has made and ordered human nature so that the soul, when it prefers or chooses such an immediate exertion or change in the body, that change follows at once. While I am walking, I am not conscious of any action in my mind except my continuous preference or choice, moment by moment, that my bodily sensations and motions should go on, together with a constant, habitual expectation, confirmed by experience, that as soon as I prefer such an action, those sensations and motions will in fact arise, instantly and without fail. But this is not the case with flying. A man may, in a broad sense, prefer flying to walking, but under the present circumstances he does not prefer, desire, or will any immediate bodily exertion to fly, because he has no expectation that he could achieve that result by any such effort. Therefore, he does not actually will or incline to any bodily exertion for flying, knowing it would be entirely pointless. So, if we carefully distinguish the real objects of the will's acts, we will see that such examples do not show any real difference between volition and preference. A man's choosing, his liking best, or being pleased with something are all the same as his willing that thing. Thus, we often express an act of the will by saying, it pleased him to do this or that. In common speech, doing as one wills and doing as one pleases mean exactly the same thing. Mr. Locke says, the will is entirely different from desire. In fact, during the very same action, desire can move in the opposite direction from what the will leads us to do. For example, he says, someone I cannot refuse may require me to persuade another person, but while I am speaking, I may wish that my persuasion does not succeed. In this case, clearly, the will and desire run counter to each other. I do not mean to suggest that will and desire are precisely the same thing. The word will is broader, applying to both things present and absent, while desire refers only to something absent. For example, I may prefer my current situation, such as sitting still or having my eyes open, and so may will it, though it is not something I desire, since I already possess it. Still, I do not believe that will and desire are so entirely distinct that they can ever truly be said to oppose one another. A person never wills anything contrary to his desires, nor desires anything contrary to his will. The example Mr. Locke provides does not actually show that this ever happens. A man may, for one reason or another, will to say words meant to persuade someone, while at the same time wishing that those words will not actually persuade. Yet even here, his will and his desire are not truly in conflict. What he wills, he also desires. He does not will a thing and simultaneously desire the opposite. The confusion arises from not paying careful attention to the specific object of each act, the thing that is willed and the thing that is desired. If this distinction is observed, it becomes clear that will and desire do not clash at all. The thing he wills, in this instance, is simply to speak certain words, and the same reasoning leads him not to desire the opposite, so, all things considered, he chooses to speak and does not desire not to speak. As for what Mr. Locke calls the object of desire, that the words, though persuasive, may not succeed, his will is not contrary to this either. In fact, he wills that they should not be effective, as he desires. To prove that will and desire can truly conflict, it would have to be shown that they are opposed regarding the very same thing at the same time. But here, the objects are different, and for each one, will and desire agree. It is not surprising that will and desire may not align regarding different objects, even if they are similar in nature. Indeed, in Locke's own example, a person may desire to use persuasion, and at the same time desire that his persuasion not succeed. But no one would say that desire is in conflict with desire, or that this proves desire is fundamentally different from itself. The same point applies to another example Locke gives, about a man desiring to be free from pain, and so on. But, rather than dwell any longer on the question of whether desire and will, or preference and volition, are exactly the same, I trust all will agree on this. In every act of the will, there is an act of choosing. In every volition, there is a preference, a prevailing inclination of the soul, so that, in that moment, the soul is no longer in a state of perfect indifference regarding the object of its will. In every exercise or movement of the will, the mind tips the balance one way or another. The soul would rather have or do one thing than another, or rather than not have or do it at all. Where there is absolutely no preference or choice, where there is perfect, ongoing balance, there is no volition at all. Section 2. Concerning the determination of the will. When we speak of determining the will, if we mean anything by this phrase, we must mean causing the act of the will or the choice to be this way rather than another. The will is said to be determined when, as a result of some action or influence, its choice is directed toward and fixed upon a particular object. For example, when we talk about the determination of motion, we mean causing a body's movement to go in one direction rather than another. The determination of the will assumes there is an effect, which must have a cause. If the will is determined, there must be something, or someone, that determines it. Even those who say the will determines itself imply this. In that case, the will is both the determiner and the determined. It acts as a cause upon itself, producing effects on itself and being the object of its own action and influence. Regarding that crucial question, what determines the will? It would be tedious and unnecessary to review every opinion that has been put forward on the matter, nor do I need to address every argument debated in connection with the question, does the will always follow the last dictate of the understanding? For my purpose here, it is enough to say this: the will is determined by the motive that, in the mind's view, appears strongest. I should, however, explain what I mean. By motive, I mean everything that moves, stirs, or invites the mind to choose, whether that is a single thing or many things together. Often, multiple factors may unite and combine their force to influence the mind. When that happens, their combined strength forms one complex motive. When I refer to the strongest motive, I mean the full combined strength of whatever factors operate to induce a particular act of volition, whether it is the force of one thing alone or of many things acting together. Whatever serves as a motive in this sense must be something present in the mind's view or understanding. Nothing can move or invite the mind to will or act in any way unless it is perceived, or somehow comes before the mind. Whatever is completely unperceived and entirely absent from the mind cannot affect it at all. It is clear that nothing can reach or influence the mind in any way except as it is perceived or considered. I believe everyone will agree that anything truly called a motive, excitement, or inducement for a perceiving, willing being must have some real tendency or advantage to move or influence the will, before it produces any effect or act of the will. This prior tendency is what I mean by the strength of a motive. A motive that has less power or seems less attractive in the mind's view is what I call a weaker motive. Conversely, the motive that appears most inviting and, according to the mind's understanding or perception, has the greatest ability to stir and persuade the will, is what I call the strongest motive. In this sense, I believe the will is always determined by the strongest motive. The things that appear to the mind gain their power or tendency to move the will from many factors: the nature and circumstances of what is viewed, the nature and state of the mind viewing it, and the degree and manner of its attention, details that would be difficult to list completely. But I think this much is clear, and not open to real debate: whatever is perceived or considered by an intelligent, willing agent, and which operates as a motive to volition or choice, is regarded or viewed as good. A thing has no power to move the will except to the degree that it appears good or desirable. To suggest otherwise is to claim that things can influence the mind to choose them for reasons other than appearing worthy of choice, which is absurd. Therefore, it must be true in some sense that the will is always determined by what appears to be the greatest good. However, to rightly understand this, there are 2 points that must be carefully and clearly kept in mind. 1. It is important to note what I mean by the word good. In this context, I use good as equivalent to agreeable. For something to appear good to the mind, as I use the phrase, is simply for it to seem agreeable or pleasing. Certainly, nothing seems attractive or worthy of choice to the mind if it is considered evil or disagreeable, or even if it is merely indifferent, neither agreeable nor disagreeable. If something draws the inclination or moves the will, it does so only as something that fits or suits the mind. Therefore, what most attracts and engages the mind is that which, in its view, suits it best and pleases it most. In this sense, it is the greatest apparent good. To claim otherwise is almost to speak a direct contradiction. In this sense, the word good also includes the removal or avoidance of evil, or anything disagreeable or uncomfortable. It is agreeable and pleasing to avoid what is disagreeable or painful, and to have discomfort taken away. Thus, this includes what Mr. Locke claims determines the will. When he speaks of uneasiness as what moves the will, he means that the motive or goal that governs the choice is the avoidance or removal of that uneasiness, which is the same thing as seeking and choosing what is easier and more agreeable. 2. When I say that the will follows the greatest apparent good, or, as I have explained, that every act of will aims at what seems most agreeable, it is essential to clarify, so as to prevent confusion or unnecessary objections, that I am referring to the direct and immediate object of the will's action, not to something only indirectly or remotely related to it. Many acts of will have a remote connection to other objects that differ from what is immediately chosen. For example, consider a drunkard who has a glass of liquor before him and must choose whether or not to drink it. The immediate objects of his will, the things his present choice directly concerns, are his own actions, to drink or to abstain. His choice will certainly follow what, in his present view, taking everything into account, seems most agreeable to him at that moment. If he chooses to drink, then drinking, as it now appears to his mind, with all its current attractions, is more agreeable and pleasing to him than abstaining. Yet, there are also remote objects connected to this act, such as the immediate pleasure he expects from drinking and the future misery he believes will follow. He may judge that the misery to come will be more unpleasant than any discomfort in abstaining right now. But these two are not the immediate objects the will is choosing between in the moment. The present act of the will is simply about whether to drink or not. If he chooses to drink, then drinking is the direct object of his will, and for some reason, it now appears most agreeable and suited to him. If he chooses to refrain, then refraining is the immediate object, and that is what pleases him most in that instant. If, in his choice, he prefers a smaller, immediate pleasure over a greater future benefit, then that lesser present pleasure appears to him more agreeable than the distant advantage. If, on the other hand, he chooses the future benefit, then that future advantage appears most agreeable and suited to him. Either way, the will always aligns itself with what, at that very moment, appears as the greatest good or most pleasing option. I have chosen to state it this way: the will always follows the greatest apparent good, or the will follows what appears most agreeable, rather than saying, the will is determined by the greatest apparent good, because for the mind, what appears most agreeable and what the mind prefers are almost inseparable. If we are to be completely precise, it might be more proper to say that the voluntary action, which immediately follows the mind's choice, is determined by what appears most agreeable, rather than the choice itself. Yet, volition itself is always determined by whatever, in the mind's perception of the object, makes it appear most agreeable. I say in or about the mind's view of the object because what influences an object to seem agreeable is not only what appears in the object itself, but also the manner in which the mind views it and the current state and circumstances of the mind. Listing every detail that affects how the mind perceives the agreeableness of the objects of choice would be a difficult task, one that might require a book of its own, and is unnecessary for my present purpose. I will therefore mention only a few things in general. 1. One factor that makes an object of choice seem agreeable is its apparent nature and circumstances. There are several aspects of this kind that can make the object more or less appealing. 1. The qualities that appear in the object itself, whether the object seems beautiful and pleasant, or ugly and unpleasant to the mind, as it is considered in itself. 2. The apparent amount of pleasure or trouble that comes with the object, or results from it. The experiences and outcomes connected to the object are seen as part of it, and so they influence how agreeable it appears when the mind considers it as a possible choice. 3. The apparent timing of the pleasure or trouble involved, whether it is near or far in the future. It is naturally pleasing to the mind to experience pleasure soon, and displeasing to have it delayed. So, if the mind sees two options that offer the same amount of pleasure in every way except that one can be had now and the other only later, the closer one will seem more agreeable and will therefore be chosen. Even if the pleasure is equal when considered in itself, the one that is nearer in time has the added advantage of immediacy, making it more attractive. 2. Another factor that makes an object of choice agreeable, as it appears in the mind, is the manner in which it is viewed. If the object is something connected to future pleasure, it is not only the degree of expected pleasure that matters, but also how the mind perceives it, especially in two important ways. 1. The degree of certainty with which the mind expects the pleasure. It is more pleasing to anticipate a certain happiness than an uncertain one. All else being equal, a pleasure that seems more probable is more attractive to the mind than one that seems less certain. 2. The vividness or strength of the mind's idea of the future pleasure. When we think about things, past, present, or future, we have much stronger impressions of some things than others. That is, our mental image can be more clear, lively, or intense. For instance, our direct experience of something through the senses is usually much stronger than when we merely imagine it. My sense of the sun is more vivid when I look at it than when I only picture it in my mind. The taste of a delicious fruit is much stronger when I actually eat it than when I only imagine it. Sometimes, our idea of something we contemplate can be much clearer at one moment than at another. For example, a man may have a much stronger sense of the pleasure he will get from eating a certain food he loves at one time than at another. The strength or vividness of our idea of future good or evil has a powerful influence on the will. When two kinds of future pleasure are offered, and both are judged equally good and certain, the one of which the mind has a more lively sense will have a far greater effect on the mind, attracting it and moving the will. The mind will be more drawn to the pleasure it can vividly imagine than to one it barely senses. This stronger vision stirs the greatest appetite and causes the most discomfort when it is lacking, and the mind naturally prefers to have its discomfort relieved and its appetite satisfied. If several possible future pleasures are presented at once, some judged greater, some less, and if the mind has a clearer or stronger idea of some than of others, or if some seem more certain than others, and if those that seem more agreeable in one respect seem less so in another, then, all else being equal, the total agreeableness of each option will be a kind of combination of three things: the amount of good the mind expects, the apparent certainty or probability of that good, and the vividness of the mind's sense of it. All these factors together determine how agreeable an object seems right now, and thus, how the will is moved. I should also note that the state of mind of the person considering an option is another factor that makes an object seem more or less agreeable. The temperament of a person, whether it is inborn, developed through education, shaped by example or habit, or affected by a particular mood at the moment, will influence what appears pleasing or displeasing. What one person finds attractive may not appeal to another, and even the same person can see the same thing as more or less agreeable at different times. For some, following reason is most agreeable; for others, it is following their appetites. Some find it more agreeable to resist a bad desire than to indulge it, while others most prefer to gratify even their lowest passions. Some find it more disagreeable than others to break a past resolution. In these and many other ways, what is most agreeable will differ from one person to another, and even for the same person at different times. Yet, perhaps it is not necessary to list the state of the mind as a separate source of an object's agreeableness, distinct from the other two factors I have already mentioned: the apparent nature and circumstances of the object, and the manner in which the mind views it. If we look at it closely, a person's temperament or state of mind changes the agreeableness of objects only by making those objects themselves seem more or less beautiful or ugly, or more or less attended by pleasure or pain, or by affecting how vivid and lively those impressions are in the mind. Still, it is certain that, in every instance, the will follows what appears to be the greatest good in the way already described. The mind's choice never departs from that which, in the moment and regarding the direct object of decision, seems most agreeable and pleasing, all things considered. If the immediate object of the will is a person's own action, then whatever action seems most agreeable to him is what he wills. If, in the present moment and taking everything into account, it suits him best to walk, then he wills to walk. If it is more agreeable to speak, then he chooses to speak. If it is best to remain silent, then he chooses silence. There is scarcely any truth more plain and universally experienced than this. When people act voluntarily, and do what they please, they always do what suits them best, or what is most agreeable to them. To say that someone does what pleases them but not what is agreeable to them is to say that a person does what they please but does not act on their own pleasure, which is to say that they do what they please and yet do not do what they please, a clear contradiction. From these considerations, it becomes clear that, in a certain sense, the will always follows the last dictate of the understanding. But here, understanding must be understood broadly, as including the whole faculty of perception or awareness, not just what we call reason or judgment. If, by the dictate of the understanding, we mean only what reason declares to be best, or most beneficial for a person's happiness over their entire lifetime, then it is not true that the will always follows this dictate. That kind of rational judgment is very different from what now appears most agreeable when all the elements of the mind's present perception are considered together. Although this rational dictate does influence the overall impression of good that the will follows, sometimes adding to, and sometimes taking away from, other motives, yet it is only one part of the whole. When reason's judgment aligns with other motives, its weight is added to them, strengthening their pull in the same direction. But when it opposes other motives, it adds resistance in the opposite direction, lessening their effect. Still, this resistance is often outweighed by stronger motives, so the will can be determined contrary to reason's judgment. I hope these points help, at least in part, to illustrate and confirm what I stated at the start of this section. The will is always determined by the strongest motive, or, in other words, by whatever view in the mind has the greatest power to excite volition. Whether or not I have succeeded in precisely explaining what makes one motive stronger than another, any shortcoming here does not overturn the principle itself, which is self-evident and crucial for the arguments that follow. I trust that, by the end of this discussion on human liberty, the truth of this principle will stand out with even greater clarity. Section 3. Concerning the meaning of the terms, necessity, impossibility, inability, and contingency. Words like necessary, impossible, and similar terms are often used in debates about free will and moral agency. Therefore, it is important to be clear about what they mean. I might begin by saying that something is called necessary when it must happen and cannot be otherwise. But this does not truly define necessity, any more than explaining the word must by saying there is necessity. The words must, can, and cannot also need explanation, just as much as necessary and impossible, though we tend to use the former words more often from early childhood. In ordinary language, necessary is a relative term. It refers to some supposed opposition to the existence of a thing, a resistance that is overcome or proves powerless to prevent or change it. In its original and proper sense, something is necessary if it will happen, regardless of any imaginable opposition. To say something is necessary is the same as saying it is impossible for it not to happen. But the word impossible is also a relative term. It refers to some supposed power applied to make something happen, which is not enough to achieve the result, just as unable is relative to ability or effort that falls short. Likewise, the word irresistible is always relative, referring to resistance that is either actually present or could be made, but which cannot withstand the force brought against it or prevent its effect. The common understanding of necessity and impossibility always includes the idea of something that frustrates effort or desire. Several important points about this must be considered. 1. A thing is said to be necessary, in general terms, when it will exist or come to pass no matter what opposition may arise from any source. Yet, something is called necessary for us when it remains true or will certainly happen regardless of any opposition that we ourselves could possibly bring against it. The same observation holds for words like impossible, and similar expressions. 2. Words such as necessary, impossible, irresistible, and the like are especially significant in debates about freedom and moral agency. In these discussions, they are most often used in this second sense, that is, as necessary or impossible for us, meaning with respect to any conceivable effort or opposition of our own. 3. Since the word necessity, in ordinary language, is always relative and points to some imagined but inadequate opposition, whenever we say that something is necessary for us, we mean it in relation to some potential resistance of our wills, or some voluntary action or effort on our part to the contrary. For we do not truly oppose an event in any way except by voluntarily setting ourselves against it. Thus, things are said to be necessary, or must happen, as far as we are concerned, when they do happen, or will happen, even if we desire or strive to the utmost to prevent or change them. Such opposition always either involves, or presupposes, an opposition of our wills. It is clear that all such words and phrases, as commonly used, are understood in this way. Something is called necessary when we cannot avoid it, no matter what we do. Likewise, a thing is said to be impossible for us when we would wish to accomplish it, or seek to bring it about, and try for it, or at the very least, might be expected to desire and pursue it, yet all our desires and efforts would be in vain. That which is called irresistible is that which defeats every attempt, resistance, and effort we make against it. And we are said to be unable to do something when all our supposed wishes and efforts fall short. In ordinary speech, we are accustomed to apply and understand these terms in this way. We grow up with this habit, which, through daily use from childhood, becomes firmly established. The idea of some supposed will, desire, or effort of our own becomes so closely joined with these terms that whenever we hear them, the association is immediate and enduring. Even if we try to use these words as technical terms with a different meaning, unless we are extremely careful, we will naturally drift back into the common usage, applying the words inconsistently, which leads to confusion and error in our reasoning, even when we intend to use them precisely. 4. From all this, it follows that when terms like necessary, impossible, irresistible, unable, and so forth are used in situations where no will, desire, or effort is even possible, where the very nature of the situation excludes all opposition, then these words are not being used in their proper sense. The reason is plain. In such cases, we cannot speak meaningfully of opposition or effort. Therefore, if anyone applies these words in such cases, he uses them either nonsensically, or with some new meaning different from their original sense. For example, if someone were to claim that it is necessary for a man, or must be, that he should choose virtue over vice as long as he prefers virtue to vice, and that it is impossible and irresistible for it to be otherwise as long as this preference lasts, he would be using the terms must and irresistible either without meaning or in a new sense, quite apart from their common use. As already noted, these words are ordinarily spoken with reference to possible opposition, unwillingness, and resistance, but here, by definition, there is none, for the case assumes only willingness and choice. 5. Thus, it is evident that philosophers and metaphysicians often use words like necessary and impossible in ways very different from their usual and original meaning. They apply them to many situations where no opposition is possible, for instance, to the existence of God before the world was made, when nothing else existed, or to various attributes and actions of God, such as his love for himself, his delight in righteousness, and his hatred of sin. They also use them to describe many inclinations and actions of created, intelligent beings where, by the very terms, any opposition of the will is excluded. Metaphysical or philosophical necessity is nothing more than certainty itself. Here, I do not mean the certainty of our knowledge, but the certainty within the things themselves, a certainty that forms the foundation for our knowing them to be true, and which grounds the infallibility of any statement that asserts their existence. The usual definition given for philosophical necessity, namely, that by which a thing cannot but be, or that which makes it impossible for something to be otherwise, fails to properly explain the term for two reasons. First, the phrases can or cannot themselves require as much explanation as the word necessity. We could just as well define cannot by necessity as we could define necessity by cannot. For example, if someone asks what we mean when we say something cannot but be, we might reply, it must necessarily be so, just as easily as we might define necessity by saying, it is that by which a thing cannot but be. Second, this definition suffers from the same major issue already discussed. The words cannot or unable are fundamentally relational, referring to power that is, or could be, exerted regarding the thing in question, whereas, as I have pointed out, the word necessity, as used by philosophers, is not meant in this way. Philosophical necessity, in truth, is nothing other than the full and unbreakable connection between the things referred to by the subject and predicate of a proposition that affirms something to be true. When such a connection exists, then what is stated in the proposition is necessary, in the philosophical sense, regardless of whether any contrary effort or opposition is imagined. Whenever the subject and predicate of a proposition, which asserts the existence of something, whether substance, quality, act, or circumstance, are fully and certainly connected, then the existence of that thing is said to be necessary in a metaphysical sense. It is in this sense that I use the word necessity throughout the following discussion, as I aim to show that necessity is not at odds with liberty. The subject and predicate of a statement affirming that something exists can have a full, fixed, and certain connection in several different ways. 1. First, the subject and predicate may be perfectly connected by their very nature, because denying their connection would result in a contradiction or a clear absurdity. In this way, some things are necessary in themselves. For example, the eternal existence of being in general is necessary, because to deny the existence of being, or to say there was once absolute nothingness, would be the height of absurdity, the very sum of all contradictions. A fuller demonstration of this could be given if this were the place for it. Likewise, God's infinity and other divine attributes are necessary in this sense. It is also necessary, by its very nature, that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that all straight lines drawn from the center of a circle to its edge are equal in length. It is fitting and right that people should do to others as they would want done to themselves. In this way, countless metaphysical and mathematical truths are necessary by their very nature, their subject and predicate are perfectly connected in themselves. 2. Second, the connection between subject and predicate may be fixed and made certain because the thing in question already exists, or has existed in the past. Its existence is already secured, and so any statement affirming its present or past reality is now necessarily and unchangeably true. A past event has determined the matter, making it impossible for existence not to be rightly affirmed of it. Thus, whatever has already happened is now necessary. It is impossible for it not to be true that such a thing has taken place. 3. Third, the subject and predicate of a proposition may be necessarily connected as a consequence, so that the thing's existence is necessarily bound up with something else that is itself necessary in one of the previous senses. That is, its existence is fully and surely connected either with what is absolutely necessary by nature, or with something that already exists. This type of necessity can be understood as the connection between two or more propositions. Anything that is perfectly connected with what is necessary becomes necessary itself, by a necessity of consequence. It is worth noting that all things which are still future, or which will begin to exist at some later point, can only be necessary in this last way. Their existence is not necessary in itself, for if it were, they would always have existed. Nor have they become necessary by already coming to pass. Therefore, the only way anything yet to occur can be necessary is by its connection with something that is necessary in its own nature, or with something that already is or has been, so that, once the one is granted, the other inevitably follows. This is also the only way anything past, except for what has always existed from eternity, could have been necessary before it happened. For this reason, this is the only way in which any effect or event, or anything that has had or will have a beginning, could have come into being necessarily or will necessarily exist in the future. Thus, it is this kind of necessity that most closely pertains to debates about the actions of the will. It may help, in these debates, to further clarify the idea of metaphysical necessity, especially in light of the earlier distinction between necessity as commonly understood, that things which exist can be said to be necessary either in a general or in a particular sense. The existence of something is said to be necessary in a general way when, considering everything together, there is a foundation for certainty in its existence, that is, when, from the broadest and most comprehensive view, the subject and predicate of the statement affirming its existence are joined with infallible connection. An event, or the existence of something, is said to be necessary in a particular sense when nothing that can possibly be considered, regarding a certain person, thing, or moment, changes the certainty of the event or existence. In other words, nothing relevant can affect the absolute connection between the subject and predicate in the statement affirming its existence. So, for that person or thing, at least at that time, it is as if the existence were necessary in the most absolute and universal sense. For example, there are many things that happen to particular people, in whose existence their own will has no part, at least, at that time, which, whether or not they are necessary with regard to all things in general, are nevertheless necessary for them, and with respect to any will of theirs at that moment, since they prevent any act of the will concerning the matter. I will have reason to refer to this point when discussing specific examples later. Whether those things that are necessary in a particular sense are also necessary in a general sense is a question for later consideration. Whatever the answer, it does not change the usefulness of this distinction between types of necessity. These observations should be enough to explain the technical meaning of the terms necessary and necessity, as used by philosophers and theological writers, in a sense that is broader and somewhat different from their ordinary, everyday use, which I explained earlier. What has just been said to clarify the terms necessary and necessity is also sufficient for explaining the opposite terms, impossible and impossibility. The only difference is that the latter are negative, while the former are positive. Impossibility is nothing other than negative necessity, or a necessity that something should not be. It is also used as a technical term in the same, broader way as necessity, differing from its original, everyday meaning. The same can be said regarding the words unable and inability. As previously noted, these terms, in their ordinary and original sense, refer to situations where the will and effort, so far as they can be supposed, are not sufficient to accomplish what is intended. However, philosophers and theologians, especially those writing about debates over free will, often use these terms in a much broader and quite different sense, applying them to situations where there is, or even could be, no will or effort to bring about the result. Just as necessary, impossible, and unable are used by controversial writers in ways that depart from their usual meaning, so too is the word contingent. Originally, something is said to be contingent, or to happen by chance or accident, when we do not perceive its connection to its causes or earlier conditions according to the regular course of things, and therefore have no way to foresee it. In particular, we call something contingent or accidental, as far as we are concerned, when it happens without our foreknowledge and outside our intention or plan. But in philosophical and theological writing, the word contingent is frequently used in a much different sense, not for something whose connection to the chain of causes is simply hidden from us, so that we cannot foresee it, but for something that truly has no prior ground or reason to which its existence is firmly and certainly joined. Section 4. On the distinction between natural and moral necessity and inability. The kind of necessity described above, a certainty grounded in the unbreakable connection between the subject and predicate of a proposition, when it applies to intelligent beings, is commonly divided into natural necessity and moral necessity. I will not pause here to question whether this is the most precise or perfect distinction, but will simply explain how these two types of necessity are generally understood, and how I will use the terms in the discussion that follows. The phrase moral necessity is used in several ways. Sometimes it refers to a necessity that arises from moral obligation. For example, we say a man is under necessity when he is bound by duty or conscience in such a way that he cannot be released. In other cases, necessity refers to a strong obligation of personal interest. At times, moral necessity describes the apparent connection between things that gives rise to moral evidence. This distinguishes it from absolute necessity, which is the unfailing connection that forms the basis of absolute certainty. In this sense, moral necessity is almost the same as a very high probability, one that is usually enough to satisfy people in their decisions and conduct, as they consider their own safety and well-being, and how they ought to treat others in society. Sometimes, too, moral necessity refers to that kind of necessary connection and consequence that comes from moral causes, such as the power of desire, or the strength of motives, and the close link that often exists between such motives and certain choices or actions. This is the sense in which I use the term moral necessity throughout this discussion. By natural necessity, when applied to human beings, I mean that kind of necessity which comes from the force of natural causes, as opposed to what are called moral causes, such as habits, dispositions of the heart, and moral motives or inducements. For instance, when people are placed in certain situations, they inevitably experience specific sensations. They feel pain when their bodies are wounded. They see what is before them in a clear light when their eyes are open. In the same way, they immediately agree to the truth of certain statements, as soon as the words are understood, such as that 2 + 2 = 4, that black is not white, and that two parallel lines can never cross. By a like natural necessity, human bodies fall downward when nothing holds them up. But several points should be noted about these two types of necessity. 1. Moral necessity can be just as absolute as natural necessity. That is, the effect may be just as perfectly connected with its moral cause as a necessary effect is with its natural cause. Whether or not the will is always determined by the strongest motive, or whether it can ever resist or oppose the greatest present inclination, if this point is disputed, still, no one would deny that, in some situations, a prior bias or the motive presented can be so strong that the act of the will is unavoidably and completely joined to it. When motives or prior biases are especially strong, everyone agrees that it is difficult to go against them. If they are made even stronger, the difficulty increases. Therefore, if the strength of motive or bias were raised to a certain degree, the difficulty would become so great that it would be utterly impossible to overcome it. For this obvious reason, whatever power a person may have to overcome obstacles, that power is not infinite and cannot go beyond certain limits. If a person can overcome 10 degrees of difficulty with 20 degrees of strength, because his strength surpasses the difficulty, yet if the difficulty is raised to 30, or 100, or 1,000, and his strength remains the same, it becomes wholly impossible for him to overcome it. So, as it must be admitted that there can be a real and perfect connection between moral causes and their effects, this is exactly what I mean by moral necessity. 2. When I make this distinction between moral and natural necessity, I do not mean to suggest that, if something happens by moral necessity, the nature of things is not involved as it is in natural necessity. I am not claiming that, when a moral habit or motive is so strong that the act of the will follows inevitably, this does not arise from the very nature of things. But natural and moral are the terms commonly used to distinguish these two forms of necessity, and there must be some words to tell them apart, for the difference is significant in its consequences. However, this difference does not lie so much in the kind of connection, but in the kinds of things that are connected. The cause, in the case of moral necessity, is something moral in nature, such as a prior habitual disposition or a motive presented to the mind. The effect is also moral in kind, consisting in some inclination or act of the will, or a voluntary action. I take it that what is called natural necessity, set apart from moral necessity, is so named because it involves only what we refer to as mere nature, apart from any element of choice. The term nature is often used in contrast to choice, not because nature never plays a part in our choosing, but likely because our idea of nature is first formed by observing the regular course of events in matters where our will has no role, most notably in the material world, where the order and sequence of things are plainly visible and fixed. But when we cannot easily see the rule or connection, though such a connection does, in fact, exist according to some established law, we tend to use other terms to describe how things happen. Even in many cases involving the physical, lifeless world, if things do not clearly happen according to a set pattern, people do not call that pattern nature, but instead use words like accident, chance, or contingency. In this way, people often set nature and choice apart, as if they were entirely and always distinct. Yet, I think no one would deny that choice itself often arises from nature just as truly as any other event. The only difference is that the connection between acts of choice and their causes, though governed by established laws, is not as apparent to us. We notice, too, that choice seems to act as a new source of motion and action, different from the more obvious and regular order of things, especially in the physical world. Choice often steps in, interrupts, and changes the course of events among external objects, causing things to happen differently than they otherwise would. For this reason, choice is spoken of as a principle of motion altogether separate from nature, and is regularly set in contrast to it. People tend to name things according to what is most immediately obvious, based on what they see and sense without deeper reflection or investigation. 3. It should be noted that, in what has been described as moral necessity, the word necessity is not used in its original sense. As stated earlier, words like necessary, impossible, and irresistible, in ordinary speech and in their most proper meaning, are always relative. They refer to some imagined voluntary opposition or effort that is not strong enough to prevail. But in the case of moral necessity, no such opposition or contrary will can even be supposed, for it is a certainty of the inclination and will itself. There can be no idea of the will resisting itself, since it is absurd to think of the same will opposing itself in the very moment of acting, just as it is nonsensical to speak of a single body moving in two opposite directions at the same time. Therefore, in this case, it is never possible to test whether a resisting or opposing will could overcome this necessity, because the situation itself does not allow for such a trial. What has been said about natural and moral necessity helps to clarify what is meant by natural and moral inability. We say someone is naturally unable to do something when, even if they want to do it, they cannot, because what we usually call nature does not permit it, or because of some outside defect or obstacle unrelated to their will. This might be a limitation in their understanding, their physical constitution, or external circumstances. Moral inability, by contrast, does not arise from any of these, but from a lack of desire, or from the power of an opposing desire, or from a lack of sufficient motives to move the will, or from the strength of motives leading in the opposite direction. In truth, all of these can be summed up in one idea. Moral inability consists in either a lack of inclination, or the dominance of an opposing inclination. When someone is unable to will or choose a thing because they lack motives, or because opposing motives prevail, it amounts to the same as being unable due to a lack of inclination, or to the dominance of a contrary inclination in those circumstances and under such influences. Here are some examples of moral inability. A woman of great honor and purity may be morally unable to sell herself to her servant. A child filled with love and devotion to his parents may be unable to kill his father. A man given to lust, when faced with certain temptations and without restraints, may be unable to resist indulging his desires. A drunkard, in certain conditions, may be unable to refrain from drinking. A deeply malicious person may be unable to act kindly toward an enemy, or even wish for his good. Some may be so gripped by a corrupt nature that they are unable to love even those who most deserve their affection and esteem. A strong habit of virtue and a deep measure of holiness can cause a moral inability to love evil, making a person unable to delight in wickedness or prefer a sinful life over a virtuous one. On the other hand, a deeply ingrained habit of evil may place a person under an inability to love and choose holiness, so that he is utterly unable to love an infinitely holy God, or to choose and cling to him as his highest good. Here it may be helpful to notice a distinction within moral inability, namely, between what is general and habitual, and what is particular and occasional. By general and habitual moral inability, I mean an inability of the heart to engage in any actions or choices of a certain kind, due to a deep-seated and ongoing inclination, or a settled absence of a particular kind of desire. For example, a person who is thoroughly unkind may be unable to perform the acts of generosity that another, who is naturally good-natured, regularly does. Likewise, someone whose heart is consistently lacking in gratitude may be unable to show thankfulness because he simply lacks a grateful disposition. By particular and occasional moral inability, I mean an inability of the will or heart to perform a specific act, due to the particular force or lack of present motives or inducements brought before the mind at that moment. If it is true that the will is always determined by the strongest motive, then it necessarily follows that the will always has this sort of inability. It cannot, in any instance, act contrary to the motive that currently has the greatest power to move it. The first kind of moral inability, the general and habitual, is most often called inability, because the term, in its original and proper sense, refers to a consistent or fixed lack. This kind of inability is also more likely to be called by that name for another reason. As mentioned earlier, inability is at root a relative term, and refers to situations where will and effort, though conceivable, are inadequate to accomplish what is wanted. This appearance of striving against a settled habit gives more of a sense of real inability than does a fleeting, momentary influence. Strictly speaking, though, it is never truly possible for will or effort to oppose present acts of the will, whether those acts come from habit or from momentary causes, for that would be to imagine the will, at one and the same moment, to be both as it is and otherwise than it is. Still, will and effort can be directed against future acts of the will, or choices that are expected to happen later. There is nothing contradictory in supposing that the will at one time may oppose the will at another time, and it is possible to desire or try to prevent or bring about future choices. However, these desires and efforts are often rendered ineffective by the force of a fixed habit. When the moment returns, the strength of habit overpowers and frustrates all such opposition. In this sense, a person can be a wretched slave, bound to a strong habit. On the other hand, it is often much easier to alter future actions that are only occasional or temporary, because if one foresees the cause or occasion, it can often be avoided with little trouble. For this reason, moral inability that results from strong habits is especially referred to as inability. Also, just as the will can indirectly and distantly try to resist itself, and fail, in the case of powerful habits, so too reason can struggle against present acts of the will, and its resistance be fruitless. This is more often the case when the actions in question arise from strong habits. Yet it must be noted that, in both forms of moral inability, the word inability is used in a way quite different from its original meaning. Properly speaking, inability refers only to a natural inability, and applies only to situations where it is at least possible for a person to have the will or desire to do what they are said to be unable to do. According to normal language, it is not truly correct to say that a malicious man, however spiteful, cannot keep himself from striking, or that he is unable to show kindness to his neighbor, nor that a drunkard, no matter how strong his craving, cannot keep the cup from his lips. Strictly speaking, a man has the power to do something if it is within his choice or under his control, and he cannot rightly be called unable to do something when he could do it if he chose. It is an incorrect use of words to say that someone cannot perform external actions that depend on the will, actions which would be easily accomplished if only the will to do them were present. If it is improper to say that a person cannot perform outward voluntary actions that rely on the will, it is even more improper to say that he is unable to perform acts of the will itself. This is clearly false, for to say so is to speak a plain contradiction. It is to say, he cannot will if he does will. In such cases, not only is it true that a man can easily do the thing if he wills it, but the act of willing itself is the very act in question, Once he has willed it, the thing is done, and nothing more is required. Thus, to blame non-performance in these situations on a lack of power or ability is not accurate, for what is missing is not the ability, but the will. The mind possesses the necessary faculties, the nature has the needed capacity, and everything else is sufficient, except for the disposition. The only thing lacking is a willing heart. Section 5. On the meaning of liberty and moral agency. The plain and straightforward meaning of the words freedom and liberty in ordinary speech is this: the power, opportunity, or advantage a person has to do as he pleases. In other words, liberty means being free from any hindrance or obstacle that would prevent someone from acting or conducting himself in any respect as he wills. The opposite of liberty, whatever we may call it, is a person's being hindered or unable to act according to his will, or being forced to act otherwise. If this is indeed the meaning of the word liberty in everyday language, as surely anyone who understands common speech and is not biased must admit, then it follows that, strictly speaking, neither liberty nor its opposite can properly be attributed to anything except what has a will, or the power of choosing. For whatever does not possess a will cannot have any power or opportunity to act according to its will, nor can it be forced to act contrary to its will, nor restrained from acting as it wishes. Therefore, to speak of liberty, or its contrary, as belonging to the will itself is not sensible, if we use words according to their original and proper meaning. The will is not an agent that has a will of its own. The power of choosing does not have the power to choose. The one who possesses the power of willing is the man, or the soul, not the will itself. It is the person, the agent who has a will, who is free to act according to his will, not the will that he possesses. We speak rightly when we say that a bird released from a cage has the power and liberty to fly, but we do not say that the bird's power of flying itself has liberty. To be free is a property of a person who possesses faculties and abilities, just as being clever, brave, generous, or zealous are personal qualities. These are all attributes of individuals, not of abstract properties themselves. There are two things opposed to what is commonly called liberty. The first is constraint, also called force, compulsion, or coercion, when a person is made to do something against his will. The second is restraint, when someone is prevented or lacks the power to do what he wills. But that which has no will cannot be the subject of either of these conditions. I need not say much more about this, since Mr. Locke has already explained it so clearly in his essay on human understanding. One more point should be observed about what is commonly called liberty. The power and opportunity for a person to act as he wills, or according to his choice, is all that is meant by liberty. This definition makes no reference to the cause of that choice, or to how the person came to have such a will, whether it was brought about by some external motive, or by an internal habit, whether it was determined by a prior act of will, or happened for no apparent reason at all, whether it was necessarily connected to something preceding or not. However a person comes by his choice, if he is able and nothing hinders him from pursuing and carrying out his will, then, according to the primary and common understanding of freedom, the man is perfectly free. What has already been explained should be enough to show what is meant by liberty, according to the ordinary understanding of people and the most basic use of the word. However, the word liberty, as used by Arminians, Pelagians, and others who oppose the Calvinist view, has a completely different meaning. Their conception of liberty includes several key points. 1. They define liberty as a self-determining power within the will, or a certain sovereignty that the will is over itself and its own acts, so that it determines its own choices. This means that the will is not dependent, in its decisions, on any cause outside itself, nor determined by anything that comes before its own acts. 2. According to their view, liberty also includes indifference, that is, that before the act of choosing, the mind is in a state of balance or neutrality. 3. Another essential feature of their definition is contingency, not in the ordinary sense of the word, as previously explained, but as something that stands opposed to all necessity or any fixed and certain connection with a prior ground or reason for its existence. They regard these features as so essential to liberty that, unless the will of a person is free in this sense, he has no true freedom, even if he is fully able to act according to his will. A moral agent is a being who is capable of actions that carry moral weight, actions that can properly be called good or evil, virtuous or wicked, praiseworthy or blameworthy. To moral agency belong certain qualities, a moral faculty, or a sense of moral good and evil, a sense of merit or worthiness, of praise or blame, reward or punishment, and the capacity to be influenced by moral inducements or motives, presented to the mind through understanding and reason, prompting behavior that aligns with the moral sense. For example, the sun does great good by its action and influence on the earth, warming it and causing it to bear fruit, but it is not a moral agent. Its beneficial action is not virtuous or deserving of praise. Fire, if it breaks out in a city and destroys much of it, acts very destructively, but it is not a moral agent. What it does is not wicked or sinful, nor is it deserving of punishment. Animals are not moral agents either. The actions of some are useful and pleasant, while others are harmful. Yet, since they do not possess a moral faculty or sense of merit, and do not act by choice guided by reason, but only by instinct, and cannot be influenced by moral motives, their actions are not truly virtuous or sinful. They are not, in a proper sense, the objects of moral judgment or reward and punishment, as human beings are for their good or evil deeds. It should be noted that there is a circumstantial difference between the moral agency of a ruler and that of a subject. I call this a circumstantial difference because it arises only from the different moral influences and motives that apply to each, depending on their situation. A ruler, when acting in that capacity, cannot be influenced by a moral law with its threats and promises, rewards and punishments, in the same way a subject can, though both ruler and subject may be moved by an understanding of moral good and evil. For this reason, the moral agency of the Supreme Being, who acts always and only as ruler over his creatures, and never as a subject, differs in this respect from the moral agency of created intelligent beings. God's actions, especially those carried out as moral governor, possess moral qualities and are good in the highest sense. They are perfectly holy and righteous, and we must see him as being moved, above all else, by the highest of moral motives, the moral good that he perceives in his actions. Therefore, God is, in the fullest sense, a moral agent, the very source of all moral ability and agency, the fountain and standard of all virtue and moral good. Yet, because he is supreme over all, it is impossible for him to be influenced by law or command, by promises or threats, by rewards or punishments, or by advice or warning. The essential qualities of a moral agent are found in God in their greatest possible perfection. He has understanding to distinguish between moral good and evil, a capacity to recognize that moral worth or demerit by which some things are worthy of praise and others deserve blame or punishment, and the ability to choose, making choices guided by perfect understanding. He also has the power to act according to his will, doing always what is most praiseworthy. In this, we see a large part of what is meant by the image of God in which he created man, as spoken of in Genesis 1:26-27 and 9-6. By these faculties and qualities, man is set apart from the beasts and is capable of moral agency. This is the natural image of God in man, while the spiritual and moral image, given to man at first, consisted in the moral excellence with which he was originally endowed.